Thank you so much for watching our stories. It's made especially for you. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the bell. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a man in a suit who looked far too formal for the salty air of the city's harbor district. It wasn't the kind of envelope that got lost in a pile of bills or junk mail. Thick paper, embossed seal, and the faint scent of cedar when he broke it open. Inside, the words were short, almost too simple for the weight they carried. To Mr. Alexander Hale, in accordance with the last will and testament of your late uncle, Edmund Hale, you are hereby named the sole heir to the property known as Isla Dorada, including all structures, rights, and surrounding waters as registered in the Maritime Land Registry, effective immediately. Alexander read it 3 times, his eyes narrowing with every pass. His uncle Edmund had been a figure of mystery for as long as he could remember, a man who appeared at rare family gatherings only to vanish again, leaving behind the faint scent of cigars and sea breeze. No one in the family had ever really known where he lived. Now Alexander knew, a private island, and it belonged to him. He wasn't the kind of man to waste time. By that afternoon, he had booked a small charter to take him there. He imagined a modest plot of land with a crumbling shack, maybe a dock in need of repair. But when the boat's engine went silent and the island came into view, his chest tightened. It wasn't modest, it was breathtaking. The shoreline curved in a perfect crescent, sand so white it looked unreal under the sunlight. Palm trees swayed lazily in the wind, their shadows dancing over turquoise waters. At the island's center, green hills rolled upward toward a cliff where a single house stood, modern, angular, and yet somehow at home with the wildness around it. The caretaker, an older man named Jonah, met him at the dock. His handshake was firm, his eyes unreadable. "Your uncle loved this place," Jonah said simply, as if that explained everything. "Said it was the only place he could breathe." Alexander didn't know what to say, so he let the silence stretch, the sound of waves filling it. The house was well kept, furnished with a kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money. Large windows opened to endless ocean views. There were bookshelves lined with weathered novels, maps pinned to the walls, and photographs of sunsets taken from the cliffside. His uncle had left no sign of a bustling social life, just traces of a solitary existence bound to this place. That night, Alexander stood alone on the balcony, a glass of scotch in hand. The air smelled of salt and possibility. The city felt a million miles away, and for the first time in years, he didn't hear the constant hum of traffic in his head. He could hear his own thoughts. By morning, he had already made a decision. This place wasn't going to be just a personal retreat. It had potential to be something extraordinary. He imagined a luxury haven, a place where the world's elite could escape for privacy and indulgence. He saw private villas along the coast, infinity pools that seemed to merge with the sea, fine dining under the stars. It would be exclusive, the kind of place people whispered about, but few ever saw. Jonah frowned when Alexander mentioned it. "Your uncle didn't build this for luxury," he said. "He built it to protect it." But Alexander only smiled. "And now I'll protect it in my own way, by making it something the world will admire." In his mind, the transformation had already begun. He spent days walking the island, sketching ideas, imagining where new structures could rise. Every sunrise brought a new spark of ambition, every sunset a quiet reminder of the power he now held. This wasn't just about business, it was about legacy. What he didn't know was that his vision for the island would soon collide with someone else's. A person who would see this place not as a blank canvas for opulence, but as a sanctuary that needed to remain untouched. A person who would challenge not just his plans, but the way he saw the world. And as Alexander looked out over the endless horizon that first week, he had no idea that the island he thought he owned was about to own him. The first time Alexander heard her name, it was spoken with a hint of disapproval. Jonah had been standing by the veranda railing, arms crossed, watching the sun rise. "If you're serious about building anything here," he said, "you'll need someone who understands this land, someone who won't ruin it." He handed Alexander a small business card. No logo, just a name and a number written in an elegant looping hand. Elena Marlowe, Environmental architect. Alexander frowned. An architect? I already know what I want. Villas, a spa, a pier for private yachts. Jonah cut him off. And if you bring in someone who doesn't respect the island, you'll lose more than you gain. Elena, she has a way of listening to places, and she'll tell you what this one's saying. It sounded poetic and impractical, two things Alexander had no patience for, but he kept the card anyway. That evening, curiosity got the better of him. He called. Her voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, with a kind of quiet confidence that came from not needing to impress anyone. "I'll come," she said after hearing his pitch, "but I won't promise I'll take the job. I need to see the island first." 2 days later, the small seaplane touched down in the bay, and Elena stepped onto the dock. She wasn't what Alexander had expected. No stiff corporate suit, no folder of glossy blueprints. She wore light linen trousers, a weathered satchel slung over her shoulder, and her hair, dark, sun-touched at the ends, was tied back loosely, strands dancing in the breeze. Her eyes scanned the island slowly, like she was reading a language only she understood. She didn't rush to greet him. She let the place speak to her before she spoke to him. "You've got something rare here," she said finally, turning toward him. "But if you build it wrong, you'll kill it." Alexander smirked. "I didn't bring you here to talk me out of building. I brought you here to make it possible." They walked the island together. She asked strange questions about the way the wind moved through certain parts of the forest, about where the sea turtles nested, about the tides and the soil. She knelt in the sand to study tiny patterns left by crabs, touched the bark of old trees with the reverence of a historian touching ancient ruins. By the end of the day, she had sketched something entirely different from what Alexander had imagined. No high rises, no concrete walls, everything built from materials that belong here, villas that blend into the hills, energy from the sun and the wind, paths, not roads. This island can be luxurious without being loud. Alexander looked at the sketches and felt conflicted. It was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't the kind of beauty he had in mind. Her vision was understated, subtle and patient, qualities he rarely valued in business. "This won't impress the kind of clients I'm targeting," he said. "It will impress the kind of clients worth having," she replied. And then, with a faint smile, "If all you want is a monument to your ego, I'm not your architect." It was the first time in years that someone had spoken to him like that, not as a man to please, but as a man to challenge. Something in her tone made him pause. He could have dismissed her right there, found another architect who would give him exactly what he wanted. But as the sun set behind her, casting the sky in golden fire, Alexander realized he didn't want her to leave. Not yet. That night, over dinner on the veranda, their conversations stretched beyond blueprints and budgets. She spoke of the years she had spent traveling to remote places, designing structures that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. She told him about a coastal village she had saved from overdevelopment, how she had fought investors twice her size and won. And in turn, he told her about the city, the skyscrapers he'd built, the deals he'd closed, the nights he'd spent chasing success, only to find it felt strangely hollow. By the time the candles had burned low, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were opposites, yes, but not enemies, not yet. What Alexander didn't realize was that Elena had already decided something. She would take the job, not because she believed in his vision, but because she believed she could change it. And so began the battle for Isla Dorada, a battle between luxury and restraint, between possession and preservation, between two people who had no idea that in trying to shape the island, they would end up shaping each other. From the moment Elena officially accepted the role, the island stopped being a tranquil inheritance and became a battlefield, not of weapons or soldiers, but of ideas, and the casualties were patience, compromise, and occasionally polite conversation. In the first planning meeting, held at the long wooden table in the great room, Alexander unrolled a large sheet of paper filled with glossy renderings. His designs were bold and unapologetic. Sleek glass villas lined along the shore, a towering spa with panoramic ocean views, a grand entrance with a marble walkway that looked more suited to a royal palace than a remote island. Elena didn't even sit before she spoke. "You'd have to bulldoze half the native palms for this," she said, tapping a finger against the proposed villa placement. And here, this pier is going straight over the turtle nesting grounds. It's not just irresponsible, it's destructive. Alexander leaned back, crossing his arms. Luxury has a footprint, Elena. People paying for exclusivity expect comfort. They want to be impressed. They'll be more impressed if the island still breathes when they leave, she shot back. And so it went. Days filled with tours around the island, where one saw possibilities for profit and the other saw dangers for preservation. Alexander would point to a stretch of untouched beach and imagine a champagne bar. Elena would see a fragile dune ecosystem. He'd talk about helicopter pads for convenience. She'd remind him of the nesting birds whose patterns would be disrupted. Their arguments were not quiet affairs. Jonah, who often found himself caught between them, described it as watching a thunderstorm argue with the sea. One moment the air would crackle with sharp words, the next it would hum with a tense silence that felt almost electric. And yet, for all the frustration, Alexander couldn't ignore the way she moved through the island, confident, assured, as if every step she took was guided by something deeper than logic. She seemed to belong here in a way he didn't, and maybe that's what irritated him the most. One afternoon, they hiked to the northern cliffs to discuss the placement of a planned observation deck. The climb was steep, the heat oppressive. By the time they reached the top, Alexander was slightly winded, but Elena stood at the edge, arms spread as if she could embrace the whole horizon. "This," she said, her voice carried by the wind, "is where people will remember why they came here. Not because of imported marble or gold fixtures, but because of this view. You don't need to touch it, just give them a way to stand here safely and let it speak for itself." Alexander joined her at the edge. The sea below roared against the rocks, sending up plumes of mist. The sun painted the water in streaks of silver. He had to admit, it was humbling. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind tangled strands of her hair, brushing them against his shoulder. And then she glanced at him, a small smirk forming. "You're seeing it, aren't you? The island doesn't need you to improve it. It just needs you not to ruin it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're relentless. I have to be. People like you rarely listen otherwise." But that night, long after she had retired to the guest cottage, Alexander found himself pacing the veranda, whiskey in hand. Her words replayed in his mind, not as an insult, but as a challenge he wasn't sure he wanted to win. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender his vision. The next morning, he unveiled a compromise, structures that kept her eco-friendly principles, but still leaned toward elegance. She didn't smile, but she didn't reject it outright either. It was the beginning of something neither could quite name. The line between disagreement and fascination began to blur. Their debates grew more charged, their silences more weighted, and sometimes, when the work paused and the sun dipped low, they would catch each other staring, not in defiance but in something dangerously close to curiosity. Neither of them realized it yet, but the island was doing exactly what it had done for Alexander's uncle. It was changing them. The days on the island had begun to blur together into a strange rhythm, sunrises painted in soft gold, days filled with the sound of tools, laughter from the workers, and the low hum of the sea. Yet beneath this surface calm, there was an unspoken tension building between them. It wasn't only about the project anymore. Something deeper was shifting, something neither of them dared to put into words. The businessman's vision was grand. He had already ordered rare materials to be shipped in, exotic marble from distant quarries, polished teakwood cut from ancient trees, and chandeliers that would arrive in crates like treasure. To him, the island was an empty canvas on which he could paint his legacy. He wanted it to impress, to seduce, to make people gasp the moment they stepped foot on its shores. But to the architect, every decision he made was a battle against the island's soul. She argued for reclaimed wood instead of cutting new trees, for rainwater harvesting instead of installing massive water pipelines, for solar panels instead of diesel generators. She spoke of balance, of giving back as much as they took, of ensuring that the island remained alive long after they were gone. Their meetings became duels. At the large wooden table in the temporary headquarters, blueprint pages were pushed back and forth like weapons. His voice would rise, hers would sharpen, and the workers outside would exchange wary glances. One afternoon, a storm was brewing, not just between them but in the sky itself. The horizon darkened in a way that made the sea look heavier, almost black. The wind carried a warning, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of rain. She was reviewing the site's foundation plans when he walked in, holding a rolled-up document under his arm. "I've approved the new guest villa designs," he said, unrolling the paper. 6 suites, infinity pool, private docks for yachts. Her eyes darted over the sketches and she froze. "You want to place them here? This part of the coastline is unstable. It will require cutting down half the mangrove trees to build your precious docks." He didn't flinch. "The docks are necessary. Guests won't want to anchor in open water and take a dinghy to shore like fishermen. They'll expect luxury," she cut in, her voice trembling with frustration. "Yes, I know, but do you ever stop to think about what this place needs, not just what your guests want?" His jaw tightened. "This island is mine. I inherited it. I can make it into whatever I want." Her hands clenched into fists. "You don't own the tides, you don't own the wind. And if you keep treating this island like a trophy, you'll destroy it before it even has a chance to breathe again." Before he could answer, the first heavy drops of rain struck the roof. The sound was sudden and loud, like the island itself was siding with her. By nightfall, the storm had fully arrived. Waves slammed against the shore, spraying salt water high into the air. The palm trees bent almost in half, their fronds snapping like whips. The wind howled through the construction site, tearing at tarps and scattering tools. They worked together through the chaos, side by side in rain-soaked clothes, shouting instructions to the crew. Wooden planks had to be tied down, generators secured, scaffolding reinforced. She climbed up ladders with ropes in her hands, her hair plastered to her face while he hauled sandbags through the mud, his expensive watch forgotten in his pocket. Lightning lit the island in bursts of white, and in those moments he caught glimpses of her determination. She wasn't just protecting her designs, she was fighting for the island itself, for something she believed in so fiercely that she didn't care how hard the rain fell or how dangerous the winds became. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the island battered but intact. The air was still damp and the sea looked calmer, though debris littered the beach. Exhausted, they stood side by side at the edge of the shore, watching the morning light creep over the waves. He spoke first, his voice low. "If the docks had been here already, they would have been destroyed last night." She didn't answer immediately, just turned her gaze toward him. "This island isn't just a piece of property. It's alive. It will fight back if you don't respect it." For the first time, something in his expression shifted. It wasn't defeat, but it wasn't stubborn defiance either. It was consideration, as if for the briefest moment, her words had made it past the wall he kept around himself. They walked back toward the construction site in silence, both lost in thought. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, and despite the destruction, there was a strange beauty to the aftermath. The storm had stripped the island bare in places, revealing its bones, its raw and untamed heart. And perhaps somewhere deep inside it had begun to strip away the walls between them too. The nights on the island had a different kind of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. Waves breathing against the shore, palms whispering under the moonlight, and the occasional song of nocturnal birds drifting through the dark. For weeks, their days had been defined by arguments over plans and materials, deadlines and budgets. Yet now, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't sudden. It was more like the slow, steady tide eroding the hard edges of the shore. They still disagreed. Oh, they disagreed often. But the tone had changed. What once felt like the clang of swords now felt more like a dance, each step revealing something unexpected in the other. One afternoon, the sun was high, gilding the ocean in molten gold, when he found her barefoot on the northern cliff. She had a sketch pad in her lap, her hair tangled from the breeze. She didn't hear him approach. He stood there for a moment, just watching, noticing the way she would bite her lip as she drew, the way her brow furrowed in deep focus. She wasn't designing a building this time, at least not in the way he knew. She was sketching the sea, the shapes of the rocks, the delicate lines of seabirds in flight. "You don't usually draw anything but blueprints," he said finally, his voice breaking the spell. She looked up, startled but not annoyed. "Not everything worth building can be measured in meters and angles," she replied, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated, then stepped closer, sitting beside her on the sun-warmed stone. For a while they simply watched the horizon together. It was one of those rare moments when words didn't seem necessary. Yet, without realizing it, he started speaking, not about business, not about the island, but about the stories he had never told anyone. He told her about the first time he'd seen the ocean as a boy, standing barefoot on wet sand and thinking it looked endless. How his father's voice had been like the waves, sometimes calm, sometimes crashing, and how his mother's laughter had been his anchor in the storms of childhood. He spoke about ambition, about the constant need to achieve more, and the quiet fear that all of it might one day prove meaningless. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She simply listened, the kind of listening that felt like shelter. Later that week, it was her turn. A sudden downpour had driven them both into the half-finished main villa. The rain pounded the roof like 1,000 tiny drums, and the air smelled of wet earth and fresh wood. She sat on the floor beside an open window, her knees drawn to her chest, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. "I used to hate the rain," she said out of nowhere. "It reminded me of the night we lost the house. My parents couldn't keep up with the mortgage. I was 16. We packed our lives into cardboard boxes and left. I remember thinking, this is what it feels like when a place stops being yours." He turned toward her, but she kept her gaze on the rain. "That's why I became an architect," she continued, "because I wanted to give people places that felt like they belonged to them, not just buildings, but homes." Her voice wavered, but she didn't shy away from the crack in it. "That's also why I hate seeing beauty destroyed for the sake of vanity." He didn't defend himself, not this time. He didn't counter with plans or figures. He only said, "Maybe I don't want to destroy it anymore." The rain softened, as if it too were listening. After that day, the island felt different. Meals turned into lingering conversations. Walks along the beach lasted until the stars appeared. They began to share more. Small things, like favorite songs and old dreams, and bigger things, like fears they had never admitted aloud. He noticed the way she laughed when she thought no one was watching, the way her hands brushed against surfaces like she was memorizing textures. She noticed how his voice softened when he spoke about the ocean, how he sometimes paused to look at the sky as if searching for something far beyond it. One evening, while working on a section of the villa together, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same piece of wood. Neither pulled away. For a heartbeat, they stayed like that, their fingers barely touching but charged with something neither of them could name. "You're different than I thought you'd be," she whispered. "So are you," he replied. It wasn't love yet, not quite, but it was something dangerous in its own way, because once walls start to fall, you can never truly put them back the way they were. By the time the last weeks of construction arrived, the island was no longer just a project. It was a place where two worlds had collided, reshaped and slowly begun to blend. And though neither of them dared to say it aloud, both knew they were no longer building just for the sake of the island. They were building something else entirely, something fragile, something rare, and something that, if they weren't careful, could change everything. The island had always been more than just a stretch of land surrounded by turquoise waters. It had been a promise. For him, it was once the symbol of victory, of wealth, of legacy. For her, it had been a challenge, a place to defend from exploitation, a fragile ecosystem that deserved respect. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into a season that neither of them wanted to end, the island became something else entirely. It became theirs. It didn't happen overnight. They hadn't simply gone from adversaries to lovers in a single swoop, like a story with predictable chapters. Their bond had been shaped by long conversations under palm trees, by arguments that left them both raw, by the silences after storms, where the only sound was the sea breathing against the shore. Each encounter, each decision about the project, had slowly eroded the walls they'd built around themselves. Now the final stage of the project loomed before them like the tide at sunset, inevitable, unstoppable. The plans for the resort were ready to be executed. The investors waited, the workers prepared, the deadlines whispered in the background like an approaching wave. And yet the man who had once dreamed of glass villas and marble promenades stood quietly on the deck of a small wooden pier, his gaze lost in the horizon, as if searching for something more precious than any business venture. She approached him silently, her sandals brushing over the warm planks. In her hands she carried the rolled blueprints of the eco-lodges they had designed together, a compromise between luxury and sustainability, between his vision and hers. She stopped beside him, the evening wind catching strands of her hair and carrying them across her face. "You've been quiet all day," she said softly. He turned his head, and for a moment she saw in his eyes not the sharp, calculating businessman she'd first met, but the man he had become, a man changed by salt air, by sunsets, by her. "I've been thinking," he replied. His voice was lower now, almost hesitant. "When I first stepped on this island, I thought I was inheriting a treasure chest, something to expand, to polish, to sell to the highest bidder. But now I think the real inheritance was this." He gestured around them. "The quiet, the stillness, the way time slows here. And maybe you." Her breath caught, though she tried to hide it with a small laugh. "That's not in the will," she teased, but her voice wavered. He smiled faintly, but it faded into something more serious. "I've made a lot of decisions in my life based on profit margins. This time I want to make one based on something else." "And what's that?" she asked. He looked at her as if the question didn't need an answer. Then, in a single breath, he said, "I don't want this to be just a resort. I want it to be our home." For a moment, she didn't speak. The sea whispered against the shore. The cicadas sang their evening chorus, and the sky deepened into molten gold. She looked down at the blueprints in her hands, the lines and measurements, the careful sketches of buildings that would house guests who might never understand the struggle that had gone into creating them. Then she looked back at him. "You're serious?" she asked. "I've never been more serious." 1,000 thoughts moved through her mind. What it would mean to stay, what it would mean to give up the life she had before, the work that had once defined her. But when she thought of mornings here, of waking to the sound of waves instead of city traffic, of seeing him across the breakfast table, of walking barefoot on sand that had become familiar as her own skin, the answer felt inevitable. "Yes," she said simply. His eyes softened in a way she'd never seen before, as though the weight of years had lifted in a single instant. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and they stood together on the pier, watching the horizon blur into night. Days later, the workers returned, but the project had shifted. The resort still took shape, but it was smaller, more intimate. The villas blended into the forest, built from reclaimed wood and designed to leave the lightest possible touch on the land. Solar panels gleamed under the sun, and rainwater systems whispered in the background. Guests would arrive, but in limited numbers, each one carefully chosen to respect the sanctuary they were entering. And at the heart of it all, a single home sat by the water's edge, a place not marked on any blueprint, a place that belonged to no investor, no contract, no deadline, only to them. Months later, when the first guests arrived and marveled at the untouched beauty of the island, they would sometimes catch a glimpse of the couple walking hand in hand along the shore, speaking in low voices, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. No one knew the full story of how they'd met, how they'd fought, how they'd slowly built not just a project but a life. But for those who stayed long enough, who watched closely, they could sense it, that the island's true magic wasn't in its beaches or its sunsets. It was in the way two very different hearts had found the same rhythm, like the tide finding the shore again and again. And on quiet nights, when the moon rose over the water and the lights of the villas twinkled softly in the distance, they would sit together on the pier, their feet dangling above the dark waves, and remember how it all began, not with an inheritance but with a battle of wills, and how in the end the island hadn't just belonged to one of them, it belonged to both.